My sister slept with my fiancé on the night of our engagement, and my family took her side. 5 years later, they called begging for £75,000 to save her failing business. Then she showed up at my door trying to break in, and karma finally made sure they all paid the price. I am 29 years old. Almost 5 years ago, my life was turned inside out in a single evening. My then fiancé Daniel and I had been together since our first year of college, nearly 5 years in total. He had thrown a surprise engagement party for me, and I remember standing in that room feeling like everything I had ever wanted was right there in front of me. The room was full of people I loved. Music was playing. Someone had strung lights across the garden. It was the kind of evening that should stay with you forever for the right reasons. Then, around an hour in, I slipped out to the back garden for some air and better phone signal, and I found my sister in the arms of the man I was engaged to. They were not having a conversation. They were kissing. Passionately, completely, with the kind of intensity that made it obvious this was not the first time and had not been brief. They were so absorbed in each other that for a few seconds they did not notice me standing there. When they finally did, they pulled apart and looked at me, and I turned and walked to my car and drove until I found a hotel. I was shaking so badly I could barely get the keycard into the door. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. I kept trying to convince myself I had misunderstood what I had seen, that there was some innocent explanation I had not thought of yet, that I had misread the situation entirely. Then the text came and every last possibility of that disappeared. My sister Clara sent hers first. She said she was sorry, but she was in love with Daniel and had been for a long time. Then Daniel sent his. He said he had proposed to me because he had hoped commitment would help him stop thinking about Clara. It had not worked. In fact, it had only made him more certain of what he wanted. He told me this was not about me, that they were simply meant to be together, that I had essentially been the path that led him to her. 5 years of my life. A placeholder. I put the phone down and sat on the floor of the hotel bathroom because it seemed like the right kind of place to be when the floor had fallen out of everything. I stayed at that hotel for nearly 4 days. I could not eat properly. I slept in pieces. I sat with what had happened and went over it again and again, looking for some angle that made it less awful, and there was none. I thought about the 5 years Daniel and I had spent together, the first months in college, the holidays, the arguments we had worked through, every ordinary day I had believed was building towards something real. All of it looked different now. I could not stop wondering how long it had been going on and what all of those normal days had actually looked like from his side. Eventually, I had to go back for my belongings and return to work before I lost my job on top of everything else. What I found when I arrived home stopped me at the front door for a moment before I could make myself go in. My entire family was still living under the same roof as Daniel, apparently simply waiting for me to come home, as though nothing had fundamentally changed. The moment I walked through the door, everyone rushed toward me. My parents, my aunt who had lived with us for years since her husband passed, Clara herself, everyone hugging me and saying how relieved they were. Clara came forward with tears on her face and wrapped her arms around me, and I stood there unable to move. Once things quieted down, I told them I was back only to collect my things and that I would be moving out permanently. Daniel, who had been standing silently to one side, announced there was no need. He would be the one leaving, since he and Clara were now openly together and would be moving in with each other. And as he said this, I looked around the room and my family was smiling. My mother had tears in her eyes. They were smiling and crying over what Clara and Daniel had done, as though it were something beautiful to celebrate. I asked them what they were smiling about. My mother said they could not change the past, but they could accept the future, and the future had Clara and Daniel in it. Clara said she was sorry for how I had found out and wished things could have been different, but that they were in love and could not help it. Then the two of them kissed right in front of me, in my own home, and my mother wiped her eye, and my father told me that these things happen and I should be happy for my sister, rather than making everything about myself. I told them to get out of my house. Nobody moved immediately. My father started to say something, and I told him I was not interested in hearing it. I went into my room, threw the essentials into a bag, and walked out a second time without another word. They called after me as I left. I did not turn around. In the weeks that followed, I received a wedding invitation from Clara and Daniel. I did not reply. Most of our mutual friends declined in solidarity with me, and I was genuinely moved by that. I had not asked them to. They simply did it. Several relatives who found out how my family had treated me in the aftermath cut contact with them entirely. The story got around. These things do. I moved out and started again. I built a new life from scratch, and I built it well. I got a better job, eventually moved to a new city, made friends who had no connection to any of this, and became a version of myself that had not been defined by what had happened to her. I did not block my family. I removed them from my social media. but kept my profile public deliberately, because I wanted them to see what I was doing and know I was thriving without them. Every now and then, I would post something and think of them seeing it. It was petty, and I know that. It was also the least I could do given what they had taken from me. 5 years passed. I heard almost nothing from them. I got on with building my career. I moved to a different city. I made new friends who knew nothing about any of this and could therefore see me as I actually was, rather than as someone who had been left behind. I dated when I felt ready, and I took my time about it. I was not unhappy. I had my life, and it was a good one. And the absence of my family in it had become something I was so used to that most days I barely noticed it. The occasional birthday message from my mother would appear, and I would ignore it and move on. Then 4 days ago, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I answered and heard my mother's voice. She told me that Clara and Daniel were in serious financial trouble. They had started a business together a couple of years ago, and it had failed. Their investors had pulled out. They had borrowed heavily to try to stay afloat, and the borrowing had not been enough. They were deep in debt with multiple creditors pursuing them and were struggling to cover basic living expenses. My parents and Daniel's family were helping what they could, but they were mostly retired and could not sustain it indefinitely. My mother wanted £75,000 from me. She said she knew I had done well and that she was coming to me as a last resort. She also told me that Clara did not know she was making this call. Clara had given strict instructions not to approach me because she knew what she had done 5 years ago and was not willing to ask me directly. My mother had called anyway because she had run out of options. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. When she finished, there was a brief silence, and then I told her I could not help them. Not would not. Could not. Clara and Daniel had given up any right to ask anything of me on the night of that party. I had worked hard for what I had. I was not going to hand £75,000 to two people who had treated me the way they had, regardless of what they were facing. My mother cried and told me she had never expected me to grow up to be so selfish. She said I would regret it if something happened to Clara, and I had to live with the knowledge that I could have helped and chose not to. I told her that was too bad, and I ended the call. Since then, she had been texting me every few hours, each message a variation on the same theme, that I was cruel, that I was punishing my sister for something that happened years ago, that this was not who she raised me to be. I read some of them and did not respond to any. Update 1, I have finally blocked my family across the board. All of them? It is long overdue. I should have done it years ago. I kept them unblocked partly because I wanted them to watch my life from a distance and understand exactly what they had given up, and partly because some small part of me always worried that sealing things completely might be something I would one day regret. That last hesitation is gone now. The practical argument for not giving the money stands entirely apart from any feelings, like £75,000 is a significant amount of money regardless of what I earn. If I were lending that to a close friend, someone I trusted completely, I would still expect it back. Clara and Daniel are not close friends. They are not people I have any reason to trust. They have already demonstrated they are capable of running a business into the ground. There is no realistic scenario in which they repay me. Handing them the money would simply be setting it on fire. I told 2 close friends about the situation, and they said exactly the same. Not out of any desire to see Clara suffer, but because the logic of it is impossible to argue with. There is no world in which handing £75,000 to people who have already run a business into the ground and who have no means or history of repaying anything makes practical sense, regardless of who they are to me. The answer is no, and it was always going to be no. I feel no guilt about this decision. I feel very little about any of it at this stage, which is perhaps the clearest sign of how completely I have moved on from this part of my life. The person who cried in that hotel room 5 years ago and the person writing this update are barely recognizable to each other. Update 2. I genuinely did not see what came next coming. I had assumed that blocking them and having the police involved would be enough to signal clearly that I was done engaging. I was wrong. I was at work when my neighbor called me. She said there was a couple at my front door who had been shouting for me for nearly an hour and refused to move. She described them. I knew before she finished exactly who it was. I drove home as quickly as I could, which took about 15 minutes. When I got there, I found Clara and Daniel at my front door in the process of trying to pick the lock. They had been there for nearly an hour and had made enough noise that my neighbor had been watching from her window the entire time. I pulled up, got out of the car, and called out to them, reaching immediately for my phone to call the police. Daniel moved faster than I expected. He crossed the distance between us in seconds and knocked my phone out of my hand. Clara came toward me and held up her hands and said they only wanted to talk. She said they did not want anything from me right now and that I should just hear them out. I told them they had a few minutes and that whatever needed to be said would be said in the garden, because under no circumstances was I opening my front door to either of them. They seemed to accept that, which was the only sensible thing either of them did that afternoon. Clara said my mother had told her about our phone call and that she found my refusal insulting given everything they were going through. She said 5 years had passed and I should be over it by now. She said I was being dramatic and self-indulgent and that my refusal to help them was a form of petty revenge that reflected badly on me, not on her. She spoke with a confidence that genuinely stunned me, as though the sequence of events that had led us here had nothing to do with her choices. And then she told me she had managed to raise the money she needed this time around by selling her house and her jewelry. But she obviously could not do that again. She wanted to know she could count on me as a fallback if things became difficult again. I told her no. Not now, not in the future, not ever. Daniel said they were not leaving until I signed a document confirming I would provide them financial support whenever needed. I told him any document signed under duress in my front garden would be legally worthless and they needed to leave my property immediately. Clara shoved me. She put both hands on me and pushed me backward and told me I owed this to them because family does not abandon family. I did not retaliate. I controlled the urge to, retrieved my phone from the ground, got back into my car, which was still running, and drove away. Once I was a safe distance away, I called the police, gave the full account, and drove back. The officers arrived quickly. Clara and Daniel were arrested and taken off my property. I knew the charges would not lead to anything severe and that they would likely be released fairly quickly, but they had been removed from my property and I was able to get inside my home and lock the door, and that was the outcome I needed. I sat in my kitchen for a while before I could settle. I heard nothing from anyone in my family for the rest of that day or the next. It was unusual enough to feel significant. I waited to see what came next. Update 3. It was my parents who came next. About a week after the arrest, they appeared at my door without warning and asked to come in. They seemed different, quieter, more subdued than I had seen them in years. There was no performance in how they carried themselves. I let them in. My mother cried almost from the moment she crossed the threshold and sat down at my kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her. My father did the talking, which in itself was a reversal of how things had always worked between them. In all the years I was growing up, my mother was the one who spoke, and my father was the one who sat quietly in support. Seeing it the other way around told me something about how seriously they had taken the journey to my door. He told me that after they found out what had happened, that Clara and Daniel had come to my home, tried to break in, and that Clara had physically pushed me. They had looked at what their daughter had become and could no longer stand behind her. He said they were cutting Clara off. He said they were sorry. He said they had protected the wrong child for too long, and they were ashamed of it. I told them I appreciated what they were saying. I meant that. It takes something to admit you have been wrong for 5 years, and to say it to someone's face without making excuses. I also told them that appreciation was not the same as forgiveness, and it was not the same as things going back to how they were. I had spent 5 years building a life that did not include them in it. That life was mine, and I was not dismantling it to accommodate people who had taken that long to recognize something that had been obvious from the start. They accepted that eventually, though it took a while, and there were a few attempts to push back. My mother said they could work on this if we both wanted to. I told her that was precisely the problem. I did not want to anymore. I had come to terms with having a life that did not include them, and I was not willing to trade the piece of that for the effort of rebuilding something that had been broken so thoroughly. My father eventually nodded. He understood, I think, even if my mother found it harder to accept. Before they left, my father asked if I would at least unblock them, so they could occasionally know I was safe and doing well. That seemed like the reasonable minimum I could offer given that they had come, said what needed to be said, and listened without arguing me out of how I felt. I agreed to unblock my parents. It felt strange to do it after so long, but it also felt like the right thing given that they had come and faced me honestly. I am not promising anything beyond that. There is no plan for regular contact or family dinners or a slow rebuilding of what was there before. That version of things is not something I am willing to attempt. But they have my number, and they know I am alive and well. And for now, that is enough. It is, I think, more than they deserve. But I am choosing to offer it anyway. Clara and Daniel remain blocked on everything. My parents have my number. They know I will not be providing any financial help to Clara and Daniel under any circumstances. Whatever happens to their debts and their situation from this point is entirely theirs to navigate. I spent 5 years building a life that no one in my family had any part in constructing. It is a good life. It is honest, and it is entirely mine. Clara and Daniel lost any claim on me the night of that party, and everything they have done since has only confirmed that I made the right call in cutting them off. My parents took 5 years and a criminal arrest to see what I saw immediately. That is their failure to live with, not mine. Whatever comes next, none of that changes.